There's a recurring pattern that has brought down every major empire in human history. Not conquest, not foreign invasion, not even violent revolution, economic implosion. Specifically, the destruction of a nation's currency. And it unfolds the exact same way every single time. Rome, the superpower that ruled the known world for 5 centuries, collapsed only after its currency became meaningless. Spain, which once possessed more gold and silver than any civilization in history, went bankrupt again and again until its empire disintegrated. Britain, the global trade titan for nearly 2 centuries, lost its world-spanning empire within a single decade after its currency collapsed. 4 times in recorded history. A dominant empire has followed the exact same sequence: military overreach, runaway spending, currency debasement, money printing, inflation, loss of confidence, collapse, and every time those in power claimed their nation was different, exceptional, untouchable, immune to the laws of history. They were wrong every single time. And right now, in 2025, the United States is tracking that same path step by step. Warning sign by warning sign. The only question left is whether we're at the beginning of the decline, the middle, or frighteningly close to the end. This is the story of how empires destroy themselves from within through their own currency. How Rome, Spain, and Britain fell. And why the same red flags are flashing again today? Rome, the blueprint of economic self-destruction. Rome dominated Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for 500 years. At its height, it controlled over 60 million people across 3 continents. Its military was unbeatable. Its infrastructure was unmatched. Its currency, the denarius, was trusted everywhere from the British Isles to the deserts of Egypt. The denarius, introduced in 211 BC, contained around 4.5 grams of pure silver. For centuries, it held its value because Roman authorities protected its purity. When someone handed you a denarius, you knew what you were getting: real silver, real value. This trust funded Rome's armies, built its aqueducts, paved its roads, and expanded its empire. But empires are expensive. Every new border required more soldiers, more forts, more roads, more administrators, and eventually more money than Rome actually possessed. So Rome did what every empire does when it spends far more than it earns. It debased the currency. Emperor Nero, 54 to 68 AD, was the first to significantly reduce the silver content in the denarius, to bankroll his extravagant lifestyle and costly military campaigns. He lowered the purity from 100% to 90%. With the same amount of silver, he could now mint 11 coins instead of 10. This was early inflation, but 90% silver was still valuable. The catastrophic damage came later, by Emperor Caracalla's reign in 211 AD. The denarius contained barely 50% silver. By 265 AD, under Emperor Gallienus, it had plummeted to only 5% silver. A coin that was once nearly pure silver had become a worthless slug of base metal with a thin silver. Wash, imagine being a Roman soldier in 265 AD, receiving pay in coins worth 1/12 of what soldiers had been paid just 2 centuries earlier. The government insisted nothing had changed. The coins still bore the emperor's face, still carried the same name, but their purchasing power had imploded. Prices skyrocketed. What costs 1 denarius in 200 AD cost 50 by 300 AD. Farmers refused to sell grain for debased coins and demanded barter. Soldiers refused to serve unless paid in gold or goods. Tax collectors couldn't collect taxes because the currency was essentially worthless. Rome's economic system froze, and here's the critical point: Rome wasn't destroyed by invaders. Rome was destroyed by its own currency. Once its money collapsed, everything built on that money, the army, the bureaucracy, the roads, the empire itself collapsed with it. The Western Roman Empire officially fell in for 76 AD, not because Germanic tribes were stronger, but because Rome could no longer pay its armies, fund its government, or maintain its infrastructure. The pattern was set. Expansion gives, overspending gives, currency debasement gives, inflation gives breakdown, gives collapse. Rome proved the model. Every empire since has repeated it. Spain, the empire that drowned in its own wealth. Fast forward 12 centuries. Spain, 1500s. The Spanish Empire is entering its golden age. Columbus has opened the New World courts, has toppled the Aztecs. Pizarro has seized the Incan Empire. Spain now controls the richest territories on earth. In 1545, Spanish explorers uncover Cerro Rico in Potosi, modern-day Bolivia. This wasn't just a silver mine. It was the largest silver deposit ever discovered. For the next 100 years, Potosi would supply nearly half of the world's silver, millions upon millions of pounds of it. Ships loaded with treasure crossed the Atlantic, flooding Spain with unimaginable wealth. Spain minted the silver into coins, creating the Spanish dollar, the world's first true global currency. It was trusted, pure, seemingly limitless. Spain became the richest and most powerful nation on the planet at its peak. The Spanish Empire controlled territory on every inhabited continent. The sun quite literally never set on Spanish dominion. And then, exactly like Rome, Spain began to unravel from within. Because there's a paradox hidden inside wealth. More money does not make you richer when everyone suddenly has more money. When Spain flooded Europe with silver, prices surged. Something that cost a single silver coin in 1500 cost 10 coins by 1600. The silver hadn't become less pure. There was simply an overwhelming excess of it, that is. Inflation. Spain imported so much silver that it unintentionally destroyed the value of silver itself. But the deeper problem was structural. Spain wasn't producing anything of lasting value. The empire wasn't building industries. It wasn't fostering innovation. It wasn't manufacturing goods. Instead, it was extracting unimaginable wealth from its colonies, only to spend it immediately on endless wars. Extravagant palaces, and luxurious imports from countries that actually produced things. The silver poured in from the Americas, and then poured right back out to France, England, and the Netherlands to pay for goods Spain couldn't produce on its own. By the late 1500s, Spain's kings were suffocating under massive debt. Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598, inherited enormous obligations from his father, 36 million ducats of debt. Instead of cutting spending, he doubled down. He borrowed more, fought more wars, opened new fronts against the Ottoman Empire, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, and against England. Eventually, the debt became unpayable, so Philip did something no major power had done before. He defaulted in 1557. Philip II halted all debt payments, triggering the first sovereign default in modern history, but it was only the beginning. Spain defaulted again in 1560, again in 1575, and again in 1596. 4 defaults in 40 years. This, despite controlling nearly half of the world's silver supply. Each bankruptcy shattered trust further. Lenders refused to extend credit. Interest rates on Spanish bonds skyrocketed. And in desperation, the government began debasing its own currency, minting coins with less silver. Introducing copper coins falsely claimed to hold the same value as silver. No one believed it. The currency lost credibility. And by the early 1600s, Spain was in terminal decline. Its military could no longer be funded. Its colonies began drifting away. And when the 30 Years' War ended in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia marked the beginning of Spain's fall from global power by 1700. The once mighty Spanish Empire was a shadow of itself. The empire that had commanded the world's wealth had spent, borrowed, and mismanaged itself into irrelevance. The pattern repeated. Massive wealth surge, runaway government spending, excessive borrowing, currency debasement, repeated defaults, loss of confidence, collapse. Spain proved that even infinite resources cannot save an empire from catastrophic financial mismanagement. Now, we move to Britain, the most expansive empire in history. Britain's empire lasted longer, stretched farther, and controlled more wealth than Rome and Spain combined. At its zenith in 1922, the British Empire governed 458 million people, 1/4 of the world's population, and held 1/4 of the world's landmass. The sun never set on the British Empire, not because of a poetic metaphor, but because the empire spans so many time zones that daylight always shone on British soil somewhere on Earth, and at the heart of it stood the British, pound sterling, for over 200 years. The pound was the world's reserve currency. More than 60% of global trade was invoiced in pounds. The gold standard anchored the system. 1 pound sterling could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. This created stability, strength, global dominance. But the empire was built on credit, and credit must always be paid back. Britain financed its empire through borrowing, government bonds, war debt, colonial administration, infrastructure, and global military expansion. As long as the pound held its value, this system functioned. Then came World War I in 1914. Britain's national debt sat at roughly $650 million. By 1919, after 4 years of total war, it had exploded to over $7 billion. That's more than a tenfold increase in 5 years to pay for the war. Britain borrowed from everyone, its own citizens, foreign governments, and especially the rising power of the United States. But the war had another consequence. It forced Britain off the gold standard. In 1914, gold convertibility was suspended. The government had to print money to survive the war effort. Maintaining full gold backing was impossible. The economy was in ruins. Britain owed colossal sums to the United States. And in 1944, even before the war had ended, the Bretton Woods Conference reshaped the global financial order. The British pound, the currency that once anchored the world, was formally replaced as the planet's primary reserve currency. The US dollar took its place. Britain fought desperately to preserve the pound's supremacy. But the fight was already lost. They carried the debt, but not the gold and not the economic strength to support their currency anymore. What followed was a slow, humiliating descent. In 1947, Britain attempted to make the pound fully convertible again. The attempt lasted 6 weeks before a devastating run on the currency forced the government to reimpose capital controls. In 1949, the pound was devalued by 30%. In 1967, it was devalued again. Each devaluation wiped out savings, shattered global confidence, and signaled to the world that Britain was no longer a first-rate power. Meanwhile, the empire crumbled. India won independence in 1947. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, and Britain's military response turned into a global embarrassment. Colony after colony slipped away, not because they were conquered, but because Britain could no longer afford to govern or defend them. By the 1970s, Britain teetered on the edge of becoming a failed state. Inflation surged to 25%. The government begged the IMF for a bailout. The pound, once the world's most respected currency, had become a symbol of national decline. That the empire that once controlled 1/4 of Earth's land and population lost almost everything in just 3 decades, not through invasion, not through conquest, but through debt, currency devaluation, and economic decay. The pattern again: war debt, currency debasement, loss of reserve status, devaluation, inflation, imperial collapse. Britain proved that even the strongest empire on earth can fall within a single generation when its currency fails. Asterisk, asterisk. Which brings us to today, the United States, the modern empire, the current reserve currency, asterisk, asterisk, and now. Every warning sign that destroyed Rome, Spain, and Britain is blinking bright red. Let's begin with the currency. The US dollar has served as the world's reserve currency since 1944. When Bretton Woods made the dollar the global anchor, at the time, it was backed by gold, $35 per ounce. Other nations pegged their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar was literally as good as gold. But like Rome, Like Britain, the United States began spending far more than it earned. The Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, a sprawling network of overseas military bases by the 1960s. Foreign countries noticed something troubling. America was printing more dollars than it had gold to redeem. France, under Charles de Gaulle, began demanding gold for its dollars. Other nations followed. Gold reserves drained out of Fort Knox. The bluff had been exposed. In 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window. No more convertibility. No more gold backing. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, just like the debased Roman denarius. Just like the British pound after 1931, backed only by confidence and government promises. At first, it seemed manageable. The petrodollar system of the 1970s created artificial, global demand for dollars, since all oil transactions were priced in USD, but the spending didn't stop. The borrowing didn't slow. The debt didn't shrink. It exploded. In 1980, U.S. national debt was $900 billion. By 2000, it was $5.6 trillion. By 2020, it had soared to $27 trillion. Today, in 2025, it exceeds $36 trillion, a 40-fold increase in 45 years and accelerating. But the debt is only half the story. Like Rome, diluting its silver. Like Spain, drowning Europe in silver. The United States began printing unprecedented amounts of money since 2008. The Federal Reserve has created trillions of dollars out of thin air. Quantitative easing. They called it a necessary intervention. They claimed during COVID, the Fed printed over $4 trillion in just 2 years. More money than had been created in the previous 100 years combined. And just like every empire before it, Washington insisted that this wouldn't cause inflation. That modern economics was different. That the old rules didn't apply. They always say that. They are always wrong by 2022. Inflation officially hit 9%, and real inflation. The prices people actually pay for food, housing, and healthcare was far higher. The dollar is being debased. Slowly at first, but the pattern always accelerates. And just like Britain, the United States is now losing its reserve currency status. In 2000, for 70% of global foreign exchange reserves were held in dollars. Today, it's 58% and falling fast. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, along with new members, are building alternatives. Trading in local currencies. Developing new payment systems. Reducing reliance on the dollar. China and Russia are stockpiling gold. Central banks worldwide are diversifying away from USD. The world is preparing for the dollar's decline, exactly as the world once prepared for the fall of the British pound. The pattern is unmistakable. And here's the most dangerous part. The United States now faces the same fatal flaw that doomed Rome, military overextension. America maintains nearly 800 military bases in more than 70 countries. The annual defense budget exceeds $800 billion. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone cost over $8 trillion. The empire is enormously expensive, and it's being sustained with debt and freshly created money, just as Rome couldn't pay its legions with debased coins. Just as Spain couldn't finance its armies after serial defaults. Just as Britain couldn't maintain its empire after its currency collapsed. The United States is running out of time. So let's break down the pattern, because once you see it, you can never unsee it. Every empire that collapsed economically followed the same sequence. Not a similar sequence, an identical one. Stage 1. Dominance. The empire is at its peak, militarily powerful, economically unstoppable, and backed by the world's trust. Rome had the denarius. Spain had the silver dollar. Britain had the pound sterling. America has the US dollar at this stage. The currency is backed by something real, gold, silver, or centuries of earned confidence. The empire appears invincible. Stage 2. Overextension. The empire expands beyond what its economy can sustain. More territories, more military promises, more obligations to citizens. Rome spread across 3 continents. Spain tried to rule every ocean. Britain colonized a quarter of the world. America maintains global bases and global commitments. Eventually, the costs surpass the revenue. Stage 3, deficit spending. The empire begins spending more than it earns. Permanently, at first, it borrows. Then it borrows more. Then deficits become structural. Rome needed to fund its legions. Spain needed to pay for endless wars. Britain financed 2 world wars. America runs trillion-dollar deficits even during economic booms. Stage 4, currency debasement, when taxation and borrowing no longer cover expenses. The empire turns to the oldest trick in the book: debase the currency. Rome diluted silver in the denarius. Spain flooded the world with silver, triggering inflation. Britain left gold, then devalued the pound repeatedly. America closed the gold window in 1971 and has printed trillions ever since. Stage 5. Inflation, more money chasing the same amount of goods, causes prices to surge. Rome saw prices rise 50-fold. Spain triggered a century of soaring prices across Europe. Britain hit 25% inflation in the 1970s. America is experiencing inflation today. Despite claims that it's transitory, Stage 6, loss of confidence, this is the beginning of the end. Citizens and foreign nations no longer trust the currency. Roman soldiers demanded gold, not denarii. Spanish lenders refused to lend after 4 defaults. The world abandoned the pound at Bretton Woods. Today, countries are moving away from the US dollar. Confidence doesn't fall gradually, it falls suddenly. Then, all at once, Stage 7, collapse the economic system cracks. The currency loses its value or its global status. The empire can no longer fund its military or maintain its influence. Rome fell when it couldn't pay to defend itself. Spain faded into irrelevance. Britain lost its empire within 1 generation, and the United States. That's the question we are living through right now. This is the pattern. 7 stages, repeated 4 times across 2,000 years. Different empires, different eras, different currencies. Same mathematical sequence. Because the math is unforgiving, you cannot spend more than you earn forever. You cannot print prosperity into existence. You cannot debase your currency without paying the price. The pattern is absolute, and the United States is in Stage 5, accelerating towards Stage 6. So what happens next? History gives us 3 outcomes. 1. Controlled. Decline. This is the British model after 1945. They lost their empire, lost reserve currency status, suffered painful inflation and devaluation, but the nation survived. Diminished, yet stable. A slow, humiliating fall, but not destruction. 2. Chaotic collapse. This is the Roman model. The currency becomes worthless. The government loses authority. The empire fragments. The only unknown is how fast and how painful the final act will be. If this changed your perspective, subscribe, because when the pattern completes, you'll want to understand exactly what happened and why history holds the answers and the pattern never lies. Thank you guys. See you next video.